This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Richard Lim of the This American President podcast. Links to learn more about Richard and This American President can be found at thisamericanpresident.com or in the show notes. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon by joining on patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen. You help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. A special thanks goes out to Alex at the executive producer level on Patreon. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network featuring great shows like our guest today, Richard Lim, and his This American President podcast can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, how to contact me, support the show, and more by going over to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. I would like to welcome Richard Lim today to the show. Richard is host of the incredible This American President podcast. Richard is also a fellow member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. You will be familiar with Richard's unique choices of who to kill and who to save from history in our previous Parthenon Podcast roundtable episodes. And this is sort of a corollary to that, in that today, since it got me thinking, Richard had some really interesting and thoughtful choices of why to kill and save certain people. I'd love to hear what he has to say of what historical events he would personally like to witness. Hopefully just witness. We're going to try not to kill anyone today. But Richard, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you. So why don't we start off with you? What would be your first historical event you'd like to witness?
Sure, absolutely. So first, let me say I love this topic. I often accost friends of mine that might not even care much about history with this question. This, or like, which 10 people, 5 people would you like to meet if you could, if you could, go back in time? And I think this is one of the quintessential history nerd questions. So always a lot of fun to talk about this. So the first event I would love to see, and this goes back to a question. So it's one of these historical mysteries. In 1783, at the end of the American Revolution, there was an event called the Newburgh Conspiracy. And this event, basically, it was a moment where some historians believe that members of Congress who wanted a strong national government were fed up with Congress in general because it was quite inept and weak and ineffective. That never happens nowadays, of course. And basically, in order to force Congress to act, they started potentially colluding with members of the military and talking about basically threatening to not disband when the war ended, and to even maybe even have a show of force to intimidate Congress into acting and taking certain measures like strengthening the federal government. And there were potentially members of the military that were not completely happy with George Washington's leadership during the war because Congress hadn't paid the soldiers. And George Washington was kind of in between. He wanted to maintain a republic and respect civilian authority, but he also loved his soldiers and hated seeing Congress not pay them. And some of them felt that Washington should have acted stronger. And to intimidate Congress, he had the power of the sword, after all, to intimidate Congress into doing his bidding, paying the soldiers, giving the federal government more power, which is something that he wanted because we were under the Articles of Confederation. Now, there has been a debate about the extent to which this conspiracy existed. And it's interesting because major members of the founders of the founding generation were in Congress at the time. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Gouverneur Morris, etc. And there are historians that believe that essentially these people were playing with fire and trying to get Congress to threaten maybe a coup, or at least, the possibility of one. And that brings up the possibility that America actually might have had a coup, which is something that thankfully we haven't dealt with in all of our history. And it's one of the things that makes America unique. Countries all over the world have had coups. And even in the past year, coups have happened. And so the fact that America hasn't had a coup, the fact that it might have happened right at the beginning, and of course, George Washington gave this incredible speech in March of 1785, which diffused the whole situation. But there's this big conspiracy, possibility of a conspiracy. So I would just love to find out, was that true? I mean, was a conspiracy really in the works, or was it kind of more, was when they say that where there's smoke, there's fire, was there actual fire? Or maybe it was just more kind of in their head and people overreacted. And again, there are different books that say different things, but I just love to know, did the founders almost have a coup happen under their watch? And, or maybe it was a bit exaggerated and an overreaction. Who knows?
Yeah, I think that's a sort of thing you'd love to see how it really unfolded from personal, like what are the arguments that are really happening behind the scenes? Because if it had happened in a later time where there was more media, you might see how it was developing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's crazy because it's all the figures that we've heard about. George Washington, Hamilton, Madison, just, all the leaders at the time. And there was a letter that got sent around, and it was an anonymous letter within the officer, in the Continental Army, and basically rousing them into threatening Congress. And, and it was actually written by somebody who worked under General Gates, Horatio Gates, who was Washington's main rival. So again, some people think maybe Congress was going to Washington's rival to, use him as an alternative. Again, and it's kind of a story we want to have be true. Like, we want it to be true that a coup almost happened and George Washington saved us from it. And, maybe he did. And even if it wasn't a real conspiracy, things could always escalate beyond intention, right? So there was still a problem that had to be dealt with. But regardless, it'd be kind of cool to know, did America almost become a banana republic right at the beginning? Who knows? Maybe.
The first one that really came to my mind is when Attila the Hun and Leo the First, the Pope of Rome, all going back. So mine's a little bit earlier than yours. In the 450s, when Attila the Hun was ravaging through Europe, and just everywhere that he went, he just dominated everything. And there was a point where he was going to go into Italy and conquer it or kick everybody's butt or something, and he was met by the Pope of Rome at that time, Leo, in northern Italy. And there's all sorts of stories, and we can get into those. But basically, after this meeting, Attila the Hun just leaves. And so it happened in 450, when in a time in the Roman Empire where the records are starting to fall apart, and clearly there's no cameras or anything there. So we don't know exactly what happened, but it's pretty clear that Attila the Hun did leave. Now there's stories that he saw Peter and Paul behind the Pope with flaming swords, and as cool as that probably was, probably didn't happen. And maybe Attila the Hun was at the end of his rope with supply lines and all that, the logistical. But what was that meeting? Did Leo just give him a ton of cash and tell him to leave, or something monumental must have happened there to make Attila the Hun say, all right, I'll take a break and leave?
That would be absolutely fascinating, because what did he say, or what did he have over his head or something that convinced this tornado of a human, this more ancient Genghis Khan to basically say, okay, There needs to be more memes about Leo the First. Like there needs to be more like, him just saying like, just stop it. Just stop it, Attila. Okay.
I believe that Attila the Hun came, and that was still fairly early career too. He had a lot of conquest and raiding and pillaging left, but for that, not too much. But he had career left in him, and he still took it and turned around, and at least for that year didn't go into Italy.
So if I had to ask you, what do you think he said, or like, what's your hunch?
I probably thought about this, that my history geek comes out, that I thought about this too much. I think there must have been some bribery, I would have to think, or it had to have been something that, okay, leave, or it could have been like, there's better picking someplace else. And it's just one of those things where it made sense, where it didn't make sense enough for Attila to actually go into Italy, because maybe he didn't want to take a loss. And so that you go do your thing, come back next year, we'll really pay you off next year. And that's that.
Do you think it's better that we don't know what Leo said? I mean, I know we'd all want to know, but do you think it's like, would the story be worse if it was like, oh, and then he, told him that, I don't know, he would give him a bunch of slaves, or I don't know, who knows,
So what do you have next up for us?
Okay. Next up. So I've been doing a bunch of research on the Industrial Revolution for a project at work. And I mean, it's pretty darn fascinating. I'm not particularly mechanically or technically gifted. I'm very qualitative rather than quantitative, however you want to look at that. But the Industrial Revolution is pretty amazing to study. And there was an event, the Great Exhibition in 1851. It was during the Victorian age, and it was actually organized by Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. And the event, some historians believe it basically marks the end of the first Industrial Revolution. And this event was basically kind of like the peak of the, how do I describe it? Like it was kind of like the peak of showcasing Western civilization. They built a giant crystal palace in London, and it was basically the first World's Fair. It was in this huge glass structure, the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London. There were 12,000 fountains circulating 120,000 gallons of water. And it was basically a history of like the progress the world had made during the previous 100 years, and just items from all over the world, because, everything was getting smaller. People were traveling to India and China, and they were bringing back silks. There were cotton mills and steam engines, lead mines, works of art, statues, carpets, wallpapers, just showing off all the latest techniques, technologies. There were electric telegraphs, organs, clocks, musical instruments. There were handguns made by Samuel Colt from the United States. There was a throne, an ivory throne of a Raja from India, dinosaur models from fossil remains. And then there was like the circus exhibitions and orchestras and all that kind of stuff. And it was the first time people started having ice cream and Jell-O and all that kind of stuff. And you would see, they described it as, because they made it very egalitarian. They had, obviously the wealthy were there. The prominent leaders of society, middle-class folks, working-class people went, and some really interesting people from history as well. Karl Marx was there. He visited. Charles Dickens, I believe, was there. So, wait, was he there? I think he was there. So anyways, anyone who was anyone in society at the time went. So I think it would just be an amazing thing to see something like that. And yes, it was basically like the British just saying, holy crap, we are awesome, but in many ways they were, and seeing all that stuff, I think would have just been amazing. And also seeing a young Queen Victoria and a young Prince Albert would be pretty awesome. I mean, here are the two people who are kind of like Victoria at least was the symbol of the empire, the most powerful empire in the world. And just seeing that would be pretty cool.
What would you say would be a corollary to today if they had brought together? Do you think you could even do something like that today?
I mean, like we have fairs and we have World's Fairs and all that kind of stuff, but it was such a different world because everything was so new at the time. I mean, I feel like nowadays in society, in order to do something like that, you have to be so novel. I think like the equivalent now, and I might be getting ahead of myself here, but the equivalent now might be like, I don't know, like a showcase of like, something SpaceX is doing now, right? Where it's like there's no one else doing something like that. And the whole world is just looking at this right here. And it's not quite the same. It's not a World's Fair, but it's like the whole world is like, holy crap, mankind is doing incredible things through this one guy right here. So I feel like it's something like that. But that was what the World's Fair, that was what the Great Exhibition was like at that time. It was, and it was totally top down. It was the royal family sponsored it and organized it. But yeah, nowadays we have so many things like that. We have conventions and, every group and, comic book fans have Comic-Con and, different things like that. And, the novelty of it isn't as great. Those events are awesome, but it's not as singular as it was then.
Yeah, maybe people are even a little bit more jaded now that getting bombarded with technology. There's so many new things come out constantly. It's not there. There was a huge jump of new things when things had been pretty much the same they had always been for a long time before.
Yeah, and there was an element of showmanship in it too. And I think you see that spirit every now and then. This past weekend, my wife and I went to Disneyland, and yeah, I mean, Disneyland's always great, but I kind of imagine, well, what was it like when it first opened, and how inventive it was. And here's a guy who has this incredible imagination, and he's like, I'm actually going to make a world based on this. And that's what he did. So I think it's really rare when that happens, but it always has to look different from previously. This was kind of a brand new idea. Having the idea of a World's Fair was new. So.
Yeah, and it's so different for you to go to Disneyland. It's like, yeah, it's cool and it's quaint and it's probably something that maybe you went as a child or something. But when your grandparents probably went there, for them, it was mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. And exactly. That's a great point. I mean, okay, I've been to a few state fairs in my life. I was fortunate to go to the New York State Fair and the Texas State Fair. Those are both great fairs. But imagine a world where, people had no idea of what they might have heard of a dinosaur, but to actually see the fossils and to have working class people being able to see these things, being able to, nowadays you can get tons of stuff that are made in China. But back then it was like coming from a different planet and getting a silk, a silk piece from China was like, holy crap, someone had to risk death to get this.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
My next one is kind of related to that in a way. Is I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and my uncle, I remember him telling me about this, and we would go in all around Buffalo and look at all the Pan American Exposition sites from 1901. And I wouldn't love to see him get killed, but to the time when William McKinley was assassinated, because it was so shocking. And it was such it put the period at the end of a sentence that the Pan American Exposition was a total disaster. It lost tons of money. It wasn't very well attended as they expected it to be. They expected it to just be this huge thing that would be such a boon to the economy. And by September, it's winding down. McKinley came to visit. The visit was okay. He doesn't die right away. When he's shot, I think he lingered for a good, at least a week. And I just cannot imagine how devastating it was to everyone, the organizers and the people that this World's Fair that was going to showcase Buffalo, showcase electricity from Niagara Falls and the newfangled AC electricity and all this, and none of it works. And then the president gets assassinated.
That's interesting. I'm familiar with, President McKinley's story and the assassination, but I didn't know that the event was considered a failure. What do you think? What was that cause? Because I know the Great Exhibition, they were decades apart. I'm sure it's comparing apples and oranges, but that was a success. What was it about the Pan American Exposition that was a failure?
I think at that point in 1901, there had been one in Chicago not too long. I think people were a little exhibitioned out. And I think that there was some transportation issues. There was some weather issues. The weather wasn't great. And they had really overinvested in it, that there was never going to be enough turnout to ever make enough money from it. And it wasn't a disaster. It was just kind of a flop. It didn't do what they had expected it to do.
And then all anyone knows about it is this horrible incident where McKinley was assassinated. And it's very unfortunate because back then, that was the third presidential assassination, but the reality is that security was just different back then. It wasn't what it is today. And so that could have happened anywhere. It could have happened in DC, just like Garfield was when he was killed there. And yet it just happened to happen, it happened at this big event that was already kind of flopping.
And I had also heard, I don't know if this is true, but they had said that there was an experimental X-ray machine there. And if they had used that, they could have maybe found where the bullet was and extracted it or done something better. And I'd also heard that there was a world-class surgeon who lived in Buffalo at the time, and he was out of town for a couple of days, and the surgeon who wound up taking care of it, he wanted his name to be the one who saved the president, and they didn't bring in this much better surgeon. And
oh, wow.
So that, it was just like one screw up after another, after another, after another.
Well, yeah, that's a fascinating event. And, it's one of those things where, the Lincoln assassination is so fascinating. Conspiracy. It was Lincoln. It was the Civil War. The Kennedy assassination. There's no shortage of fascination about that event. But the Garfield and McKinley assassinations, they don't get the same attention. But McKinley's assassination put Teddy Roosevelt in the White House, and that certainly changed American history. Teddy Roosevelt was added to the ticket because they wanted to get rid of him in New York. And I don't know of a lot of situations where they put someone as vice president to get rid of him. Maybe it happened more than I know, but that ended up putting him in the position to become president. And I always kind of wonder if McKinley hadn't been assassinated, you would have had a 2-term president, McKinley. He would have served out 2 terms. He would have been much more well-known than he is today. And does Teddy Roosevelt get the nomination in 1904? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? But what if he doesn't get the nomination? So the assassination changed a lot of things, and that'd be fascinating to study.
Yeah, that would be interesting because is it by 1904, Roosevelt hasn't done anything really noteworthy to make a name for himself to run, and then he loses, and that's all we ever hear of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, it's almost unthinkable. And maybe he does get the nomination. Maybe he does win. He was such a charismatic figure, but he was a progressive, and that party under McKinley was a conservative party. And, Marcus Hanna, the main political operator, hated Teddy Roosevelt. So maybe he doesn't get the nomination in 1904. And, he goes down in history as this colorful governor who wrote some fascinating books and loved to go safari hunting, if we even know about him.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating what if. Save McKinley and see what happens to Roosevelt.
Yeah, exactly. And then where does the progressive movement go from there without Teddy Roosevelt? They probably break through, but they don't have a guy like Teddy to lead it. Maybe Wilson is the main guy. Who knows? So
you've done the World's Fair. Now, what would be your next, a World's Exhibition? What is your next event you'd love to witness?
Yes. So first, with the caveat, I will say that these events that we're witnessing, we are witnessing without being impacted by them physically, or us having any impact on them. Because I told my wife this exercise, and she was like, "Oh, but you'll die," and it's like, "Oh, don't worry, I didn't build the time machine." But the next event also is an answer to a question, just like the first one I chose. This one, I am just so curious. Ever since I first learned about this event, the Tunguska event, basically a 12 megaton explosion on June 30th, 1908. So what is that? 37 years before the first atomic bomb, and a bit longer before the first hydrogen bomb, which was the megaton level bomb. But 30 plus years before we split the atom, an explosion happened that was basically the equivalent of a hydrogen bomb. And, it's funny that they call it the Tunguska event, because scientists are not 100% sold on what happened. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I have read a little bit about this event, and it appears to many scientists that it is not clear exactly what happened, because every possibility there is a little bit of a question mark, or basically a plot hole to whether or not that explanation is true. But in Siberia on June 30th, 1908, huge explosion, 12 megatons, and there's a ton of different accounts about what exactly happened and what the thing looked like, and the answer most people accept is that it was an airburst, where a meteor or meteorite or whatever, a piece of rock from space entered the atmosphere, and it exploded, but it didn't impact. There's no crater, and it just exploded. And so maybe the thing, because of its speed and size, the pressure itself led to an explosion, hence the airburst. But it literally flattened millions of trees. And it wasn't until a few decades later, because it was in a remote part of Siberia, it wasn't a few decades later until someone actually went, a scientist researcher went and actually started studying it and documenting it. And I mean, the photos are just, you look at it and it's just like these trees are just flattened for miles and miles. I want to know what the heck happened. And of course, there are all these crazy theories about it, everything from like aliens to time travel to experiments, the government was conducting experiments, or, maybe a wormhole opened up somewhere random. But it's like, and I've heard apocryphal stories. I don't give much credence to this, but it lends some, cool, like a mystery to it. But I've heard that people saying that the thing changed direction in the sky. I mean, again, this was in Siberia. So we have not too many eyewitness accounts, and eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable, but there are all sorts of weird stories. It looked like a lead pipe flying through the sky, who knows what, but I want to know. And honestly, I mean, it would be a scary event, because the fact that, first of all, thank God it blew up over Siberia. I mean, I don't want anything to blow up over Siberia, but if it's going to be New York City or some uninhabited wasteland, but thank God it didn't hit Moscow or any other big city. But I just want to know, like, what the heck was it? And honestly, nature's scary. Like the fact that a 12 megaton explosion can happen in the world without us really knowing why. It's a little humbling, but anyways, yes, fascinating.
Those types of things, asteroids and meteors, they still don't know. One could sneak up out of nowhere and something like that could happen.
That's true. That's that good thing we have Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck, the cast of Armageddon,
Yeah, I mean, could you almost wish, though, that it happened, maybe it didn't happen over Moscow or Paris or something, but if it happened maybe somewhere a little closer to where people could observe it, it would be nice. Not that the fact that it happened in probably the most remote place it could possibly happen, it just lends itself to all sorts of great theories.
Right. And I mean, Russia, biggest country on earth. I think it's like an eighth of the world's landmass. So I guess statistically, if it was going to happen somewhere, okay, sure, happened over the biggest country in the world. But still, yeah, just the mystery of it. What the heck happened? Just want to know. Very curious.
I wonder if it would have been probably cool. I mean, you'd hate to say cool, but to see it happen over the ocean.
Yeah. I mean, it would be horrifying and terrifying, but probably pretty fascinating to be like, wow. I mean, there have been meteors that have streaked through the sky. I know a few years ago in Russia, there was once again, Russia, that poor country, once again, like a bunch of meteorites, like, blasted through the atmosphere, and you could actually see it. There are YouTube videos of it. And I think like the sonic boom broke a few windows. Thankfully, no one died. But there were great memes because that the famous Russian switch where in Russia, blah blah blah. Like, and there was a meme that had a picture of the meteorites over Russia, and it said, "In Russia, space explores you." Anyways, but yeah, it was. It's a little scary to know that stuff. That can happen. But yeah, Tunguska, 12 megaton explosion. What the heck happened? Would love to know.
It is slightly morbid, but there's so many natural events like that just to see, because you can even watch videos of the tsunami in 2004 or the tsunami, and I just don't think videos would ever capture the terror of seeing that in person. And
no. Nature is scary. It's if you want the fear of God in you, just start studying Krakatoa in 1883 when it had the loudest sound and made everyone within 50 miles deaf. Yeah, I mean, just stuff like that is terrifying, and yet again fascinating.
The next one for me, and it's kind of a minor thing, and it doesn't really, I mean, in the whole scheme of things, it's kind of inconsequential, but it's a mystery that I've thought about so many times. I've done podcast episodes on it. Who killed Billy the Kid? And was it really Billy the Kid who died in 1881 in Fort Sumner, New Mexico? And what really, I mean, I saw Young Guns as a young man, and that always piqued my interest in it. But then recently, I drove through Fort Sumner, and we stopped there, and you just think about it. What if it's not? Well, I don't think Billy the Kid, they have a grave marker for him, but I don't think that he's actually buried there. The whole area had been wiped out in a flash flood. So maybe he's buried there, or whoever it is. The rational person would say, yeah, probably 99% Billy the Kid was killed by Pat Garrett in that abandoned fort. But just that little hint that it wasn't him. And there's enough evidence, I think, to say maybe it wasn't. And I would just love to know, did Pat Garrett just gun him down? Did he give him a chance to run? Because they were nominally chummy to each other. Would somebody just cut somebody down like that? I mean, it's the Old West, but I would just love to see it unfold.
What were the circumstances around that whole incident?
Billy the Kid, he had a career of being on the wrong side of the law, in that the law was kind of on the wrong side of the law in the New Mexican territory. And basically Pat Garrett was hired and made sheriff more or less to assassinate Billy the Kid and get him out of the way, because Billy the Kid had killed two sheriffs, and he escaped from prison awaiting trial. And it was one of those things, they just wanted him out of the way, frontier justice style. Pat Garrett found out that Billy the Kid was fluent in Spanish, and he was able to kind of hide out. But Pat Garrett finally found him, and supposedly it was a dark, dark night. He came up, Billy the Kid said in Spanish, "Who is it?" Pat Garrett supposedly recognized his voice. He shot him. The deputy, Pat Garrett's deputy, came up. He was going to do something like take some sort of relic, you might say, from Billy the Kid. I think it was to scalp him or cut off a finger or something. And Pat Garrett said, "No, you're not doing that." He sat with his dead nominally friend until morning, and then they buried him, and that was that. But the apocryphal story is that it wasn't Billy the Kid. He may have killed nobody. He may have killed the wrong person. They said it was Billy the Kid. And then Billy the Kid went to Texas, northern Texas, and lived into the 40s or the 50s. And I think there's a couple of just a little pieces of evidence that make that so plausible, because a lot of Billy the Kid's gang lived in kind of that area of Texas. So if there was a place for him to go and find refuge, take a new identity,
that was it.
Yeah, that could have been it.
Okay.
But I would just love it to be there and see it, and then maybe see somebody make a movie out of it too.
My next event, again, is kind of another mystery thing. And I know some people might not ever want to see anything like this. But again, I'm so curious about what happened, just like you with Billy the Kid. But in late 1952 and early 1953, there was an incident or event going on in the Soviet Union called, and so now we're back in Russia, the Doctor's Plot. And during this event, basically what had happened is that in the late 40s, a member of the Politburo named Andrei Zhdanov died. And someone wrote a letter saying that Zhdanov was killed by his doctor. And, this was a special Politburo doctor. So, should have been one of the best doctors in the country. He died, right? People die all the time. It doesn't mean it's the doctor's fault. But this person accused that doctor of killing Zhdanov. And then at the time, no one thought much of it. But then suddenly in the early 50s, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, who was also, in his last years, basically took that and started supporting that narrative and basically began throwing out there conspiracies about that there was a group of doctors trying to murder the Soviet leadership. And many of the doctors basically that were implicated, or at least somehow they tied it in to the idea that Jewish people were behind this. And I'm not sure if it was because they said that the doctors were Jewish, but I do know that this was around the time, just a few years after Israel became a state in 1948. And many Jews in Russia, including those associated with the Politburo, were excited about this, that they had their own country. But Stalin saw it as a threat. He said he felt that this idea of loyalty to your race competed with loyalty to your class. And so he basically started promoting these anti-Semitic policies. And there are some indications, some historians believe that Stalin was starting a purge. And some believe that it was basically that it was a plan to round up all the Jews and basically have a second Holocaust in the Soviet Union. Although other people say that he wasn't actually going after Jewish people. What he was doing was that he was trying to purge his own government, and he needed a pretext to purge. And there's this theory that, and it's not too far-fetched, but essentially by 1951, 52, Stalin felt that nuclear war with the United States was inevitable because Truman had just signed off on the hydrogen bomb. It was in the middle of the Korean War. He felt that the United States was planning to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear war. And he felt that the only way to stand up and be tough was to purge his leadership, which at the time included Molotov and Khrushchev and so on and so forth. And he had actually already started attacking them and all that. So it would be fascinating to go to those meetings and just see, what was Stalin doing? Was he plotting a second Holocaust? Was he plotting? Did he really think that the United States was about to launch a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union? Was he trying to purge his government? And he died in March of 1953. And as soon as he died, his replacements or his successors, the Politburo, immediately canceled the entire thing. And they basically said, look, the whole doctor's plot accusation was totally fabricated. It's not true, which was pretty risky because they were going against Stalin, and he had the most prestige out of all of them. But they did it nonetheless, probably to save their own skins, because maybe it was going to implicate them. But anyways, yeah, it would be fascinating to me to know, like, what was the extent of Stalin's plans? Did he really intend to purge his government? Did he, anyways, it would have been fascinating to learn about that.
There's so many things with Stalin. It's like, oh, okay, that's page 5,672 of Stalin's craziness. It's just
Right.
I think so many things that he's done. They're almost impossible to rank or wrap your mind around, because he did so many other insane things.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I mean, he had his hand in so many events. His decision to make peace with the Soviet Union, or with Nazi Germany, changed the whole calculus of the war. What he did at Yalta with President Roosevelt, even before all this, the great purges of the 1930s, and what people heard about that, and then at Yalta and then the Cold War, the Berlin airlift. I mean, his story, there's so much to know, and so much is shrouded in mystery. And I think this doctor's plot is one of the most mysterious out of all of them, because it could have been anything from another Jewish Holocaust, which obviously would have been utterly horrific, or it would have been another purge. And who knows, maybe a purge which would allow him to confront the United States and have a nuclear standoff. Who knows? Very scary implications, but either way. But again, lots of mysteries to unfold.
And that would have been, you said that was in the 50s, right before he died?
1952, 53. And it was really horrible, because when Stalin started going after the doctors, doctors became the scapegoat. Doctors and Jewish doctors. And when that happened, people literally, the faithful, the communist faithful across the country, they literally stopped believing their doctors. Like, parents would stop taking their kids to the doctor, even though their kid needed a medication. But now they thought, oh my gosh, these doctors, they're murderers. They're trying to poison my kid. I mean, just complete insane chaos, I mean, and this was all happening. And, the man died in 1953, and he died right at the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. People hoped that there would be a new, like, for détente, essentially. But yeah, I think to kind of see that, and to see so much of the Cold War, people that love history, obviously so many people study the Cold War, but oftentimes it's really hard to know what was happening on the other end, to know what was happening in the Soviet Union. So to kind of peek behind the curtain would be really crazy. Probably really depressing and intense, but still very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's an area I'd love to know more about. And there's still people who are still alive who remember that, who live there. But I think it's getting to the point where not that they're looking at it with rose-colored glasses, but so much has happened since then that it colors the way we view that early period in the Cold War.
Exactly. And it's really interesting to me, because there's this belief that, there's this debate about the extent to which the United States provoked the Soviet Union, quote unquote, and the Cold War started. But I think anyone that really studies that era knows that anything the United States did to help the Soviet Union, like with Lend-Lease, any financial assistance provided, was always met with skepticism, because people who believe in Marxism are always inherently suspicious of capitalists. And I don't think there's really anything the United States could have done that could have won Soviet trust. So, but again, that's a debate that people love to have.
I think the one thing that I always have to wrap my mind around is that in the early 50s, it wasn't fait accompli that the West was going to win. You look at it, and Russia and the US were kind of similar in economic output. I think North Korea, South Korea, like you see it now, and South Korea is so high tech, and it almost seems like it's in the future watching it now. But I don't think that South Korea's economy got bigger than North Korea's until something crazy like the late 70s, maybe even early 80s.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thing is that so much of the world was destroyed after World War II. And even parts of Western Europe, there was an appeal that communism, unfortunately, had an appeal to a lot of people. And here's Europe, including Western Europe. Central Europe, for sure, was absolutely destroyed. And people felt that just a decade earlier was the Great Depression. So there were already people that felt very leery of capitalism. And by the time, the early 50s come around, communism has spread into China. Now, not only the biggest country geographically, Russia is communist, but the biggest country population-wise is communist. And so I think that, and they also had the bomb. They had developed the bomb by then. So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of reasons. I mean, I remember being in college and people laughing at the idea of when Sputnik happened and Americans freaked out about it. And they thought that, how silly, that they would care about this little ball revolving. But in their eyes, they thought, well, if the Soviets can put a satellite in space, they could probably put a nuke into space, and who's to stop them? So, and they saw millions of people, hundreds of millions fall under communism. So yeah, context is very important.
Yeah, for sure.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
My next one is a little bit more than just one event, but it's sort of the events of one person's entire life. And it's a guy named Bar Suma. He was a Nestorian monk, a Syriac monk who was born in China in the 1200s. And he traveled all throughout China, all throughout the Middle East, and into Europe. And in this day and age, or in that day and age, rather, for somebody to travel that breadth of the old world is just mind-boggling. And to just see the different things that he would have seen in his life, where probably most of it was walking. As a monk, he probably walked or maybe rode on some sort of transport. But to have seen what he saw in all these civilizations, the Mongol civilization and Chinese civilization, and then high Middle Ages, like all of these things at their peak, the Middle East before Genghis Khan got to it, it would have been contemporaneous, more or less. But just to have seen that very few people, I mean, and his is fairly much that they believe it happened. Marco Polo, he might have made up a lot of what he did, or maybe not saw as much as he did, but this guy legit saw over half of the world, and that must have been a sight to see.
So what was his name again?
Bar Suma. Okay. And he was a monk when they were still that's a whole other interesting story, where in China, it happened sort of in two waves. There was a much earlier wave a few hundred years earlier where Nestorian monks had gone to China and built, I think really that they know of, one monastery. They had interacted a lot with the Buddhists along the way. And the core of the Nestorian church was more in Persia and in Central Asia, but they had sort of some fringes that they think may have even gone almost to Japan. And then there was a phase two, you might say, of Genghis Khan, and I think it was one of his sons. One of their wives was really into Christianity, and a couple of the Mongol lineages had gone in sort of in a Christian direction, and that was another. They were this group called the Nestorians, and they became popular. And I mean, not super popular, but they had started to establish in China again in the 1200s, and they faded out pretty much when the Mongols adopted Islam.
And they were like a heterodox Christian sect, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And they, it's amazing that these people, the Nestorians, they expanded so much. And now there's really just a small group of them in northern Iraq, a couple of 100,000 people, and then a couple of 100,000 in the rest of the world in diaspora. But they went all over the place.
That's fascinating. Yeah, so this is what, 5th century is what I'm reading. Is that about right?
This would have been,
or no?
There's another.
13th century. Yeah, I see. Okay, got it.
Yeah, there's a guy with the same or almost the same name.
Okay, yeah,
and then earlier, and I think he did some interesting travels, not quite as extensive of travels as this Soma.
Wow. So this guy literally went from like northeastern China to Western Europe, basically. Like he crossed the world's greatest landmass.
Yeah, he met
That's
with
insane.
the Pope, and that's all documented too. It's unbelievable that somebody could have traveled that much, and I think he may have traveled a better part of all the way back too.
Wow. Okay, that's fascinating. I feel like he needs to get more love than Marco Polo.
Yeah, especially. I mean, I don't know a ton about Marco Polo, but there seems to be enough question marks that he may have filled in the blanks a little bit to make his story sound more interesting.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Huh, that's fascinating. So he was the original Forrest Gump.
Yeah, I could not imagine all those wastelands to just walk across them, or maybe a camel as your conveyance, and then you get to Northern Europe and it's completely different, and the weathers that you see, and just all the different people who probably never even heard of other people. There's a very good chance that a French person may not have heard of some of the Middle Eastern people that he had met, let alone that may have not even maybe have the vaguest idea of what China was, or that it existed, but like no idea that there was no map to even point to. Right.
I mean, people who traveled, it's crazy, because when you're going through deserts, it's like you're not going to see a single person for a long time. Yeah, that's fascinating.
All right. So you're number one. I can't wait to hear number one.
Yeah. Well, so I did this in chronological order.
Oh, okay.
So yes,
no particular order.
I would say, yeah. But the last one and the most recent one, and this is not really one of mystery, this is just one of me just wanting to just see awesomeness, is I would love to see a Saturn V launch. And it might as well be the Saturn V Apollo 11 that launched Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon. And that rocket was like 360 feet tall. I mean, how people described what that rocket was like, it has 5 engines, 5 of the most powerful engines ever built, at least for a very long time. I think SpaceX is building some pretty powerful, the Starship rocket, which is going to be pretty powerful. But that Saturn V had 5 F1 engines, which had over 1 million pounds of thrust. And just the idea of just seeing something like that, seeing a mountain of fuel blast off into space, spit out so much fuel that within 3-something minutes, the entire first stage of the rocket is empty. And then, I mean, for me, the love affair with the space program started with the movie Apollo 13, and the way they do that launch sequence when they show, the first part of the rocket, the first stage breaking off, and then, the astronauts are kind of, the momentum throws them forward, and then the second stage fires and it throws them back. I mean, seeing something like that, whether it's somebody, down at Cape Canaveral watching the launch, or being able to see the astronauts, go through those Gs, those 4 or 5 Gs on their way to the moon, to carry out this incredible civilizational milestone of putting human beings on the moon, Neil and Buzz going on the moon, and then coming back safely. And then there are the pictures of, when the rocket breaks the sound barrier and you can kind of see the, the ring, the kind of that cloud on the rocket itself. It would be pretty awesome. I would love to see that.
It's amazing that we haven't, it's just finally now SpaceX, but it amazes me that they did all of that with computer technology, that kids have that. And not even talking about their PS5 or whatever, but I'm talking about toys, like baby toys that have as much computing power as they had, and that we haven't really done that again. It probably is more than time to do it.
So here's a question for you. How much memory do you think that the guidance computer on the lunar lander had? Just throw out a number.
5 megabytes, maybe?
5 megabytes? The answer, from what I've read, 18 kilobytes. We landed on the moon with less memory than like an average text message. Like one, I mean, it's insane to me that they did that. And there's this great quote where I think it was Gene Cernan, who was the last man to walk on the moon. He said that it was as if President Kennedy, when he committed America to go to the moon, it was as if he took a bit of the 21st century and put it in the 20th century, because you have these accomplishments that even today are so advanced, right? You had this lunar lander made out of, I mean, it still looks kind of cool and futuristic, that it's covered in foil and has thrusters and whatnot. Looks beautiful when you see the photos of it over the moon. And yet you look inside it and the thing is like flips and switches and it's all, pretty rudimentary compared to today. And the idea that generation got that technology to get men on the moon and back. And, that rocket, that Saturn V rocket is really an incredible thing because it takes the whole thing just to get 3 people there and back. There's nothing on that rocket that doesn't need to be there, because the more weight you have, the more fuel you need. And which means the higher it has to be, and so on and so forth. And it's heavier, more fuel, et cetera. So they needed all of that rocket and all that fuel just to get this little command module back to Earth, and it's just, it blows my mind that they did that. It really does. And, I'm a big space junkie. Andrew Chaikin has this great response when people say, why space? Why to go to space? And, it's one of those things where, JFK would answer, well, why does, when he gave a speech in Rice University, well, why does Rice play Texas? We don't need it. We don't need football. Do we really need it to survive? No. But do you want to live in a world where we don't get to do crazy cool stuff that's fun and requires excellence? No, I wouldn't want to live in that kind of world. And it's there. Let's go for it. So yeah, that was the spirit behind it. And I cannot get over the fact that 50 something years ago, we walked on the moon. Just can't get over it. 6 times too.
What do you think the moon is the next shot with SpaceX and some of these other space things? Is that the goal, you think? Do you think that is it going to just be go there a couple of times and then people get kind of tired of it again? Or do you think there has to be a little bit more to it this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would say that there are plans and ambitions. SpaceX has plans and ambitions, and NASA has. They have the Artemis program to go back to the moon, and there are people alive today that are astronauts or will be astronauts that maybe one day they're going to be on the moon or on Mars. And so they have plans for both. They're building they have a fleet of rockets. They have the Falcon Heavy rocket. They have the Starship rocket. They're building the Starship rocket. So the goal is to do that eventually. As to whether it's going to happen, I think it'd be awesome if it did. But, so much of it gets down to economics. The fact that it's a private company that's fueling so much of this literally is, I think, is helpful in that sense, because it kind of, it introduces new incentives to it. And so we'll see. I mean, I would love for that to happen. But, again, when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, people thought we'd be on space stations by, 2001. And obviously, I mean, well, we do have space stations, but people thought we'd have moon colonies by 2001, and that hasn't happened. So we'll see. We'll see. Who knows?
I guess to wrap up, for my last one, this is one that I've done 3 podcast episodes now on just this one event. So my last one was kind of a whole person's career just to watch it. This one is literally one event that probably took in an afternoon, and it's the Cadaver Synod of in the 800s. A pope was put on trial, which doesn't sound like it's that exciting, except that it was a dead pope was dug out of his grave, propped up in a chair, and then excoriated for maybe up to a couple of days. And then he was ceremonially de-poped and thrown into the Tiber River. And I have interviewed the person who's literally the expert. He wrote an entire book on it. And there's so many reasons why this happened, but to actually see a dead person, and if you look up the picture of it, there's a French painting of it, and they show a guy who looks, probably it kind of looks like a Walking Dead zombie who's been dead a while. The Pope had only been dead for a few months at this point, so he's pretty rank still and not dried out or desiccated or looks like a mummy. And they literally pulled him out of his grave, propped him up in a chair, and had another church official. Basically, he was getting deposed by the current Pope, and they had somebody behind this Pope Formosus, talking as him. And to just see that insanity, and to look and to be sitting in the crowd and seeing what all the other people thought of this, just sheer insanity, an event that really nothing had ever happened like that before, and nothing happened after that. To watch it would be absolutely priceless. What was the name of this Pope again? Pope Formosus was the one who was put on trial, and he was put on trial by Stephen VI. And there's all sorts of different political machinations of why it happened, but nobody really can explain. And there has been leaders who've been put on trial posthumously, but not personally put on trial posthumously. And just like, what got into somebody's mind that this is a good idea, and to watch what other people are thinking in the audience and in the jury, if you will, to say, why is this guy doing this, and is he out of his mind? And just what were people talking about on the coffee breaks? It just would have been unbelievable.
Well, it's crazy because it kind of reminds me of was it Nero or Caligula who, I think it was Nero who, I think he supposedly he killed his lover Poppaea, and then just kind of had her body, but he was devastated he killed her. So he had her body just displayed there, and so it was one of those things where and they did a dramatization of it, and it's really disturbing because you have this embalmed body that's just there as if she's alive. I don't know if that's actually what happened, but it's like imagining Calvin Coolidge having Warren Harding's corpse, put up in the White House, and having him put on trial for the Teapot Dome scandal or something like that.
And he did that, and nobody asked any questions about it, everybody just pretended like it was normal. That's what, right. That's what, I guess there are events in history where, the leader was so crazy, like stuff Nero did, or that, I think, who was it? I think Juan Perón, he had Eva Perón embalmed by the best embalmer in the world, so that she looked completely. I think they even have, you can Google it, Eva Perón. She's actually buried now, but it's fairly recently that she was buried. And she looks like the day she died, and she looks better than when she was alive because she was sick for a long time. But he didn't have her next to him at Argentine presidential dinners, and had somebody talking as her, and everybody's pretending that's normal. The cadaver synod just takes it to that next step of insanity.
That's crazy. Yeah, there's if you go on the Wikipedia site of the Pope, his name is Formosus. There's a really graphic painting of what that looked like. So not saying Wikipedia is the best source for all the time, but that photo, that image is pretty gross. Yeah, that's crazy. Different time, I guess, right? Different expectations. And when the Pope says so, I guess that's what people accepted. So
yeah, or maybe they didn't. That's why I would love to be there. If they're talking smack about him, like, what is this? This guy has lost his mind. What are we doing here? And that's kind of what happened afterwards. There was another meeting after that. The Pope who put him on trial died not too long afterwards. And they had another trial, you might say, and this is insane. And they had all the records burned of the synod, the cadaver synod, because they were so appalled by it. I would just, I would love to be sitting there in the audience and seeing what people were saying in the, lunch break and
right. Yeah. Like, hey, this is gross.
Yeah.
We should. Yeah, that's wild. So to recap, my 5 events: Newburgh Conspiracy, Great Exhibition of 1851, Tunguska Event, Stalin's Doctor's Plot, and the Saturn V Apollo 11 launch. And yours?
Yeah, so I talked about the Cadaver Synod, Bar Soma, the monk who traveled across Eurasia. I talked about William McKinley's assassination, and then last but not least, Pope Leo meeting with Attila the Hun. I think I thought yours were really interesting. You got some science and technology in there, some natural disasters, a good mix of items there to see. Natural disasters, that's one I did not think of. That would be, I think that of all of those, not be too close to the event, but close enough to maybe poke around a little bit and see it. Well, because you probably would have been able to be pretty far away and get some gist of what was happening.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is fascinating to me. There are probably a lot of people that wouldn't ever want to see something like that. I think if I had a certain distance away from it, it'd be pretty fascinating. What can I say?
Yeah, I think overall there's so many things, and it's hard to narrow it down to just 5 items of things.
Oh yeah,
because there's so many events that you'd love to see how they exactly play out, and you get somebody else's view of it, but just to see it yourself and to see what was actually going on would be something else.
Absolutely, very much so. Well, great conversation. I appreciate being able to talk about this.
Me too. Yeah, I hope people enjoy, and we'd love to hear what the events from history that you would like to personally view.